One of the most confusing things that can happen in a manipulative or toxic dynamic is when the other person suddenly starts confessing everything. They acknowledge all the lies, they acknowledge the manipulation, they acknowledge the jealousy, the resentment, and the motives behind what they've been doing. And in that moment, it can feel like progress. Because when someone finally starts admitting what they did, it creates this sense that something important has shifted. You start wondering if maybe this level of awareness means they're finally changing. But there's a distinction here that's incredibly important to understand. Confession is not the same thing as change, and confusing the two is one of the reasons people stay stuck in unhealthy dynamics much longer than they should. Confession often sounds very self aware. It can look like someone openly admitting to lies, manipulation, or jealousy. It can look like someone naming the motives behind their behavior, acknowledging fear, envy, control, or insecurity. Sometimes they'll even recognize that the pattern itself is deeply ingrained. They might talk about how long they've behaved this way or how automatic it feels to them. And they may even acknowledge that your instincts about the situation were correct on the surface. That kind of honesty can feel powerful. It can feel like accountability. It can feel like vulnerability. It can even feel like like healing on some level. But there's a subtle detail that matters a lot. In confession, the focus is still on talking about the behavior, not actually changing the behavior. Confession often comes with waves of guilt or shame. The person expresses remorse, the conversation becomes emotionally intense, and it can feel like a breakthrough moment. But then time passes, and eventually the same patterns begin showing up again. Because confession can be incredibly cathartic. It can feel relieving for someone to finally say the truth out loud. But confession alone doesn't require someone to stop being who they've always been. It doesn't require them to stop playing the game that they've always played. And sometimes confession can even exist alongside subtle manipulation. Instead of fully owning their behavior, parts of the conversation may shift responsibility in small ways. Responsibility might be reframed as a reaction to circumstances, to emotions, or to the dynamic between the two of you. Sometimes the behavior gets minimized by describing it as automatic. Sometimes expressions of guilt or shame appear in ways that invite reassurance or emotional caretaking from the other person. And sometimes strong, confident statements appear that seem designed to control how the conversation is directed. None of these things necessarily look aggressive or obvious, but they still pull you back into the emotional dynamic. And when that happens, a useful question to ask yourself is this: is this conversation pulling me into managing their feelings, defending myself, or proving something? Because manipulation almost always keeps the emotional game alive. Now, let's talk about what actual change looks like, because real change is usually much less exciting or it comes with much less fanfare than confession. Change shows up in behavior. It looks like someone catching themselves in real time when they start slipping into old patterns and choosing to do something different, calling themselves out quite literally, even. It looks like respecting boundaries without testing them or pushing against them. It looks like making choices that align with honesty before damage is done, not simply acknowledging things afterwards. Remorse starts to look different too. Instead of emotional waves of guilt followed by the same behavior, you begin to see consistency. Small actions that demonstrate awareness, small actions that demonstrate respect, small actions that show the person is actively choosing to operate differently. Over time, the manipulative patterns begin to show up less and less because they just aren't needed anymore. The person genuinely no longer wants to rely on them, right? I mean, if they're actually changing, why would they continue to use them or to do them? They wouldn't. And the simplest way to understand the difference between confession and change is this: confession is awareness spoken aloud, change is awareness embodied in action. Someone can talk about their motives, they can analyze their past, and can explain their patterns in great detail, but if their behavior doesn't actually shift, then they're still operating inside the same pattern. They've simply become more articulate about it. And this is where many people can get stuck. They wait for confession to eventually turn into change. But many people who live inside these patterns never actually leave what you would call confession land. They talk about their behavior, they analyze it, they explain it, but they keep running the same dynamics anyway. So, one way to stay grounded when navigating conversations like this is to think of it like a simple field guide in a way. When you hear something mentally, ask yourself which category it belongs to. Is this confession? Is this manipulation? Or is this actual change? Confession reflects awareness, but that doesn't shift behavior. Manipulation subtly pulls you back into their emotional game. Excuse you, Dash. My dachshund. And change shows up as consistent actions that align with what's being said. When you start viewing interactions through that lens, patterns become very clear. And this is something that can be very freeing because you don't actually need to try to force someone to change. You don't need to argue or convince them of anything. You just simply hold up the mirror. If someone truly does change, you'll see it. Not because they found the right words, but because the patterns that once defined their behavior simply just stop appearing. And when that happens, you won't need to analyze the difference anymore.